My husband and my mother-in-law went to Paris for a family vacation, leaving me to take care of my bedridden father-in-law. The next day, he got up and said, "I pretended to be sick to see how loyal my family was. Now let's plan a surprise for them." When they came back, they fell to their knees at the sight of what we had secretly prepared. Isabella no longer perceived it. The mansion, with its crystal chandeliers and polished mahogany furniture, had the weight of a soulless castle. It was almost ironic. Everything around her exuded luxury, but Isabella felt like a prisoner. Her captivity wasn't made of bars, but of crushing silence and an endless cycle of responsibilities she didn't choose. Isabella was just finishing adjusting the pillow under Albert's head, her father-in-law. He was sitting in his favorite armchair with his perpetually vacant expression, eyes lost in the garden beyond the window. The man who once led companies and inspired others now seemed a shadow of himself. She sighed as she glanced at the clock. Richard and Agnes had left hours ago, as always, leaving her behind with the excuse that someone needed to take care of Albert. "You don't need to worry, honey. Paris isn't going anywhere," Richard had said that morning, with a smile that only served to mask his indifference. Isabella responded with a nod, lacking the courage or energy to argue. Richard was a master at turning any discomfort she felt into something insignificant. He had always been like that. As she adjusted Albert's blanket, she felt his eyes on her, a look that seemed different, not of gratitude or affection, but something more observant, almost evaluative. It was a brief moment, but enough to make her frown. When she tried to meet his eyes again, he was already looking out the window at the garden, motionless as before. The mansion's kitchen was immaculate, a setting worthy of decoration magazines. Isabella felt a bit freer there, where she could escape for a few minutes from Agnes's suffocating presence. Her mother-in-law was a woman of impeccable appearance, always enveloped in expensive perfumes and phrases that seemed sweet at first glance, but hid sharp thorns. "You're doing a wonderful job taking care of Albert, Isabella. I don't know what we'd do without you," Agnes had said the night before, while examining her perfectly painted nails. The phrase, instead of a compliment, sounded like a reminder that Isabella should remain exactly where she was, always in the shadows. Isabella pressed her hands firmly against the marble countertop. She wondered if anyone would ever look at her as more than a functional piece of the house. For 3 years, she had been taking care of Albert, giving up any pretensions of her own life, while Richard and Agnes traveled, dined at starred restaurants, and took photos in exotic destinations. That afternoon, while reading a book aloud to Albert, the wind made the curtains sway gently. He seemed to be sleeping, but something about the way his lips moved suggested otherwise. "Are you okay?" Isabella asked, trying to sound casual. Albert opened his eyes slowly, but instead of responding, he simply gave a slight smile. It was strange. For months he had been almost apathetic, but now he seemed more present. Before she could ponder further, a familiar sound echoed through the house, Agnes's voice on the phone, echoing down the hallway. "Yes, we're almost resolving it. It's just a matter of time. Don't worry, Richard is taking care of everything." Isabella paused in the hallway. Something in Agnes's voice sounded different. There was haste and perhaps tension. When she tried to listen more closely, the conversation had already ended. That night, while washing the dishes, she felt the weight of silence fall over her once again. The mansion, so full of space, seemed to close in around her. She looked out the kitchen window, seeing the darkness of the garden. Sometimes, she imagined walking through that gate and simply leaving, but she didn't know where to go, not even how. She felt trapped not only by the mansion, but by what she believed was her responsibility. Still, the day had left something different in her mind. Small details, Like Albert's gaze and Agnes's muffled conversation began to form a cloud of unease. There was something wrong there, something she couldn't understand, but that seemed to lurk, waiting for the right moment to emerge. The wind picked up, making the windows shake. Isabella dried her hands and walked toward the hallway. Suddenly, the silence no longer seemed so safe. The morning began with a grey sky, reflecting the weight Isabella felt in her chest. The sound of Richard's car engine faded into the distance, leaving behind the usual emptiness. Once again, he had left without even looking back, only saying that business can't wait. Beside her, Agnes smiled superficially, as she always did when she wanted to appear friendly. "Don't worry, dear. Richard knows what he's doing. You have other priorities here," she said, pointing to the room where Albert was resting. The words sounded more like a command than a kindness. Isabella nodded, but something that morning seemed different. She felt a growing unease, as if the veil covering her reality was beginning to wear thin. While cleaning Richard's office, Isabella noticed an envelope on the desk. It was thick, sealed with the logo of a law firm. Richard's name was written in firm letters, and beside it was a small note from Agnes: "Review before Isabella sees." The phrase echoed in her mind like an alarm bell. Isabella knew she shouldn't open it, but the curiosity was overwhelming. Trembling, she slid a knife under the seal and removed the documents. The content was technical, full of financial terms she barely understood. However, enough was clear. It involved transfers of assets and properties. The word inheritance appeared more than once. She quickly folded the papers and put them back in the envelope, trying to act as if nothing had happened. But her heart was racing. What were they planning without her? And why was it so important that she didn't know? In the days that followed, Isabella began to pay more attention. Agnes's phone calls, previously ignored as background noise, now seemed suspicious. Agnes used a lower tone, often stepped out to the garden or locked herself in the bedroom. Some words reached Isabella like sign, transfer, and confidential. One day, while taking care of Albert, she heard Richard on the phone upstairs. He seemed irritated, speaking in a harsh tone. "She has no idea, but we need to speed this up. Time is against us." The ground seemed to disappear beneath Isabella's feet. She could only be herself. But what was he talking about? What was at stake? At dinner that night, Isabella decided to approach Richard subtly. "You've been working so much lately. Sometimes I wonder what you two are dealing with so urgently," she said, serving the soup. Richard looked up, seeming surprised by the question. He hesitated, but soon returned to his usual carefree tone. "They're just bureaucratic matters. Nothing you need to worry about, love. You've got enough with Albert, don't you think?" Isabella tried to persist, but Richard cut her off with a sharp comment. "Sometimes it seems like you forget what your role is here, Isabella. I'm taking care of what matters, so trust me." Those words burned. Isabella felt the weight of her submission like a chain around her neck. Richard dismissed her so naturally that she almost believed him. But this time, something inside her was beginning to change. She couldn't ignore the signs anymore. Albert, who until then had seemed oblivious to everything, surprised Isabella that night. He was awake, staring at the ceiling, when he called her with a weak voice. "Isabella, sit here for a moment," he said, indicating the armchair beside his bed. She obeyed, imagining he needed something, but what followed caught her off guard. "Do you think Richard and Agnes care about me?" Isabella fell silent for a moment, trying to understand the reason for the question. "Of course they do. They're always attentive to what you need." Albert let out a short, almost bitter laugh. "That's what they say, right? But you're here, always here. They're not. Have you ever wondered why?" Albert's enigmatic tone made Isabella's heart race. He continued without waiting for a response. Observe them, Isabella. Sometimes actions speak louder than words. The truth, my dear, is in the details. She was paralyzed. Albert had never spoken like this before. It was as if he was trying to tell her something without saying it directly. That night, Isabella couldn't sleep. Albert's words echoed in her mind. Something was being hidden, that was clear. Richard's gaze, Agnes's smiles, the muffled conversations. Everything indicated that there was a plot underway, and by all accounts, she was the only one who didn't know what was really happening. Richard and Agnes's car left in the morning, carrying luxurious suitcases and promises of yet another unforgettable trip. The destination was Paris, where sophisticated dinners, extravagant shopping, and five-star hotels awaited them. It was the third time in a few months that they had planned such an escape, always with the same excuse. You understand, don't you, Isabella? Someone needs to stay and take care of Dad. This time, the departure was accompanied by laughter and photographs at the mansion's gate. Isabella watched from the balcony, like a spectator of a life that didn't belong to her. Agnes seemed particularly radiant, wearing an elegant dress and holding a handbag that cost more than Isabella could earn in years. Richard didn't even look back as he got into the car. "We'll be back in 2 weeks," Agnes said, casting an almost amused glance at Isabella. "Try not to let Dad slip away, okay?" Isabella just nodded. It was another one of those phrases masked with lightness but laden with disdain. When the gate finally closed, leaving only the distant sound of the engine fading away, she let out a deep sigh. 2 weeks without them could be a relief, but also a challenge. When Isabella entered the living room, she found Albert already settled in his armchair. He seemed different, more attentive than usual. His eyes, normally fixed on emptiness, were full of intention, as if waiting for the right moment to say something. "Isabella, sit here. We have a lot to talk about." She obeyed, intrigued. Albert, who had spent the last few years alternating between apathetic looks and short phrases, now seemed full of unexpected energy. He studied her for a moment before speaking. "You're smarter than they think, aren't you? Always caring, always watching." Isabella frowned, unsure how to respond. Before she could say anything, Albert leaned forward, his eyes locked onto hers. "I'm not sick, Isabella." The words hung in the air for a moment, and Isabella felt a chill run down her spine. She laughed nervously, thinking he might be delirious. "What do you mean? Of course you are. You have doctors, medicine." "Medicine I don't take," he interrupted. "Doctors who only show up because Richard and Agnes insist on keeping up appearances." Isabella blinked, trying to process what she had heard. He continued, relentless. "I staged all of this, Isabella. From the beginning. I wanted to see how far Richard and Agnes would go to get what they want. And now, I know. I know more than I ever wanted to know." She felt the ground vanish beneath her feet. The puzzle pieces started to fit together. Richard's prolonged absences, the knowing glances between him and Agnes, the fragmented conversations she had overheard over the months. It all made sense, but the revelation was bigger than she had imagined. Albert took a small recorder from a hidden pocket in the armchair and pressed the play button. Richard's voice filled the room, cold and calculating. "We need to speed up the process. My father doesn't have much time, and I don't want Isabella sticking her nose where it doesn't belong." Next, Agnes's voice, sweet and venomous at the same time. "Isabella is a distraction. As soon as the inheritance is ours, she can go back to her little town. Maybe we'll find something to keep her away." The sound of both their laughter echoed through the room, cutting Isabella like a blade. She felt her blood chill, her chest tighten. The husband she loved, the mother-in-law who pretended to welcome her, both were plotting to discard her as if she were a disposable object. "There's more," Albert said, interrupting her thoughts. He pressed another button, and more recordings began to play. Some were of discussions about financial documents, others about Albert's deteriorating health condition. In all of them, the disdain for Isabella was evident. "Why are you showing me this now?" Isabella asked, her voice trembling. "You knew all about this and let it continue." Albert lowered his head for a moment, as if weighing his words. "I needed to be sure. They are my family, or at least I thought they were. I wanted to believe there was something good in them, that they weren't capable of this." He gestured to the recorder. "But now I see I was wrong. And you, Isabella, are the only person in this house who still has integrity." She felt a pang of irony. Integrity. She felt more like a puppet, manipulated and discarded. But there was something in Albert's eyes, a sincerity she couldn't ignore. "I need your help, Isabella," he said. "I can't do this alone. I want to expose them. I want to ensure they never have access to what I've built again. But for that, I need you." Isabella stood up, unable to stay still. She walked back and forth, trying to absorb everything. The man before her was no longer the same Albert she had cared for over 3 years. He was a strategist, a man who had spent years in silence, watching and waiting for the right moment to act. I don't know," she said, her voice wavering. "If they find out I know all this, they're capable of anything, Albert. You heard yourself." "Yes, they are," he agreed. "But together, we're stronger. You're stronger than you think, Isabella." She didn't respond. The weight of Albert's words was overwhelming. He had asked her to do something that could change her life forever, something that would require courage she wasn't sure she possessed. As the silence hung between them, Isabella knew that, whether she accepted it or not, her life would never be the same. The silence in the room was as heavy as lead. Isabella was sitting in the armchair opposite Albert, still trying to absorb everything she had heard the day before. The recorder with Richard and Agnes's confessions now rested in her hands. She squeezed the device tightly, as if it were her only anchor to reality. "There are more things you need to know, Isabella," Albert said in a deep voice, breaking the silence. She stared at him, already too tired to be surprised. However, Albert's gaze was different this time, filled with a melancholy she had never seen before. "About Richard." He paused, taking a breath. "He isn't my biological son." The words echoed through the room, and Isabella blinked, confused. "What? What do you mean? But you always treated him like my son." "Yes," Albert interrupted. "And in a way he is, but not by blood. Richard is the result of an affair Agnes had before we got married. I knew about it even before he was born, but I decided to raise the boy as my own, for Agnes's love, believing that a mistake from the past didn't have to define the future." Isabella was left speechless. The revelation was bigger than anything she could have imagined. The image of a perfect family, which was already falling apart, now seemed like just a broken facade. She tried to process what this meant for Albert and everything he had endured. Albert continued, his voice heavy. "I did everything I could to be a good father. I gave him everything I could, raised him as if he were mine. But over the years, Richard's behavior began to reflect something I couldn't ignore. Unbridled ambition, greed. These are not traits I taught him." He paused, his eyes fixed on some distant point as if reliving years of disappointment. "And now, seeing how far he's willing to go, I realize that no matter how much I tried, he chose a path of betrayal, just as his mother chose years ago." Isabella felt a mix of empathy and despair. Albert wasn't just a victim of Richard and Agnes's conspiracies, but also of decades of lies he had silently endured. "Why are you telling me this?" she asked, her voice almost a whisper. "Because you need to understand what we're facing." Albert replied. Richard and Agnes are united by something much stronger than greed. They have a pact, a bond born from lies. If we want to expose them, you need to know the whole truth. In the days that followed, Isabella began to act cautiously. She hid the recorder in different places each day, fearing someone might find it. The recordings were her greatest weapon, but also a huge risk. Richard and Agnes couldn't suspect that she knew about their plans. Meanwhile, Albert and Isabella started working together discreetly. He explained the details of the financial documents and the maneuvers Richard was trying to accelerate. Isabella learned more about the family's fortune in 1 week than in all the years of her marriage. They began to devise a plan. Isabella knew she would need to maintain appearances when Richard and Agnes returned from Paris. This meant smiling, asking superficial questions about the trip, and pretending she knew nothing. The thought disgusted her, but it was necessary. "You're stronger than you think," Albert said one night as they both reviewed papers in the office. "They underestimate you, Isabella. That's your advantage." Isabella knew he was right, but with every step she took, she felt the weight of the truth increasing. She was fighting against people who should have been her family, but had proven capable of anything to get what they wanted. And at the same time, she was alongside a man who, despite his flaws, was seeking redemption. One afternoon, while organizing the guest room, Isabella found a forgotten envelope in a drawer. It was an old photo album with pictures of Richard still as a boy. Albert was next to him in many of the photos, smiling with genuine pride. Isabella felt a tightness in her chest. Despite everything, Albert had chosen to love and care for Richard as if he were his own. Richard's betrayal now seemed even crueler. She carefully closed the album and went back to work. Each passing day, she felt more confident in her role, but also more aware of the danger. Richard and Agnes wouldn't hesitate to act if they suspected something. Isabella knew that soon she would have to confront both of them, and when that happened, she would need to be ready for the most difficult confrontation of her life. For now, her priority was to protect Albert, the evidence they had, and the fragile balance that sustained their new alliance. The weight of the truth, though overwhelming, also gave her strength. She was no longer the same submissive woman who had entered that house years ago. There was something new in Isabella now, a determination that grew with each revelation. The first rays of sunlight streamed through the office window as Albert placed a stack of documents on the table. The air was charged with urgency, but also with purpose. Isabella, sitting across from him, stared at the papers as if they represented both an escape and a sentence. "This is it," Albert said firmly. "If we can execute this plan, Richard and Agnes will never have access to my assets again." Isabella scanned the pages, trying to absorb the content. It was a bold plan to create a charitable foundation to which all of Albert's fortune would be transferred. Companies, real estate, investments, all would no longer be in his name and would be managed by an independent entity. The foundation, in turn, would have Isabella as president, a position Albert insisted she accept. "But they won't notice," Isabella asked, still hesitant. "Richard and Agnes are always keeping an eye on everything." Albert shook his head. "That's why we need to be quick. Most of the documents they sign aren't even read in full. Richard trusts that he controls everything, and Agnes keeps him distracted. Our biggest challenge will be time." That morning, Albert summoned one of his trusted lawyers, the only one he believed had not been corrupted by Richard or Agnes. Nathan was a serious man, with a long career and an impeccable record. When he arrived at the mansion, his eyes showed surprise to find Isabella at the center of the discussion. "I didn't expect her to be involved," Nathan said, looking at Albert. "She's essential," Albert replied immediately. "Without Isabella, none of this would be possible." Nathan reviewed the documents and nodded in approval. "The plan is solid but risky. If Richard or Agnes find out before everything is finalized, they might try to contest it in court." "It's a risk we're willing to take," Isabella said firmly. It was the first time she spoke with such confidence, and it surprised both men in front of her. The weeks that followed were a meticulous chess game. Isabella and Albert worked on the documents in the mornings while the house remained quiet. Nathan came daily to review the details and expedite the process. With each step, Isabella felt the pressure mounting. Every signature, every meeting brought with it the constant fear that Richard or Agnes would discover what was happening. One afternoon, while reviewing papers in the office, Isabella heard the sound of footsteps approaching. Her heart raced. She quickly covered the documents with a stack of magazines. It was only the housekeeper bringing coffee. Isabella tried to hide her relief, but the scene reminded her that there was no margin for error. The pressure began to affect Albert. One night, he had an anxiety attack, convinced that Richard was starting to suspect something. Isabella found him in the office, head in hands, breathing heavily. "You can't falter now," she said, holding his shoulders. "We're so close. Don't let them take this away from you." Albert looked at her, his eyes full of regret and determination. "I don't know how you do it, Isabella. After everything they did to you, you're still here, fighting." She took a deep breath before responding. "I'm fighting because you gave me something they never did. Trust. I won't let you face this alone." Isabella began to take a more active role in the plan. She called financial institutions, checked details with Nathan, and even reviewed legal clauses in the contracts. Gradually, her confidence grew. She was no longer just the caregiver or the sidelined wife. Now she was a key player in a game that would decide the future of Albert's fortune. Meanwhile, Albert recovered and resumed leading, his determination renewed by Isabella's strength. Together, they formed an unlikely but unbeatable team. One night, Nathan arrived with the final documents needed to complete the process. Isabella and Albert signed the papers with a mix of relief and tension. Albert's fortune now belonged to the charitable foundation, and Richard and Agnes had been completely excluded from the equation. "It's official," Nathan said. "From now on, the foundation manages all assets. No decision can be reversed without judicial approval, and both of you have full control over operations." Isabella felt a weight lift off her shoulders. The plan, which had seemed impossible at first, was finally complete. But she knew the battle was far from over. Richard and Agnes's return would be inevitable, and the confrontation would be explosively inevitable. As they bid farewell to Nathan, Isabella looked at Albert and realized something new about herself, a strength she never knew she had. She was no longer a spectator in her own life. Now she was the one guiding her destiny. The afternoon was heavy, with dark clouds covering the sky like a portent of what was to come. Isabella watched out the living room window, feeling the air thick with tension. She knew that Richard and Agnes were on their way. The suitcases had arrived before them, unloaded by a driver. The silence surrounding the house felt like a stretched wire, ready to snap. Albert was sitting in his armchair, serene, but with his eyes fixed on nothingness. He had been clear. There would be no more secrets. Richard and Agnes needed to face the truth, and it would happen that night. The sound of the automatic gate opening made Isabella hold her breath. Shortly after, Richard's car entered the garage, and he stepped out with quick strides. Agnes followed closely behind, impeccably dressed, exuding an air of superiority. Both were smiling, as if they had already won a battle they didn't even know was being fought. "We're home," Richard announced, entering through the front door. His tone was relaxed, almost triumphant. "I hope you kept things in order while we were away." Isabella stood up, maintaining her composure, while Albert remained seated. He slowly raised his eyes, and something in his gaze made Richard stop. The smile on his face gradually faded, replaced by a slight look of suspicion. "Dad?" Richard asked, approaching him. "What's going on?" "We need to talk," Albert replied with a disturbing calmness. "Now." Agnes stopped beside Richard, frowning. Talk about what? We just arrived, Albert. Can't this wait? No, Isabella responded, entering the conversation. It can't wait. The tension in the room increased as everyone settled into the living room. Richard seemed irritated, as if he disliked being taken out of control. Agnes, on the other hand, maintained a neutral expression, but her eyes scrutinized every detail, searching for clues. I'm going to be direct, Albert said, breaking the silence. While you were in Paris, I made some changes. There are no longer any assets to leave as inheritance. All of my estate has been transferred to a charitable foundation. Albert's words seemed to freeze the air in the room. Richard stood still for a few seconds, as if he hadn't understood. Then he laughed, a short and incredulous sound. You're joking, right? He said, looking at Albert. Is this some kind of joke? It's no joke, Isabella said firmly. Everything is documented. Nathan, the lawyer, took care of every detail. The foundation now controls all the properties, companies and investments that belong to Albert. Richard abruptly stood up, pointing his finger at Isabella. You! Of course you're behind this. You manipulated my father, messed with his head while I was away. I didn't need to manipulate him, Isabella replied, her voice steady. You did it yourself with your actions. He saw enough. Agnes tried to intervene, approaching Albert with a look of false tenderness. Albert, dear, why would you do something so extreme? Think carefully. We are your family. We've always been by your side. You're not my family, Albert responded, cutting her off coldly. You're parasites, and it took me too long to see that. Richard lost control. His voice rose as he shouted, accusing Isabella of being an opportunist and Albert of being mentally incapable. With each word, his anger became more evident, and he began pacing in circles around the room, unable to accept what he was hearing. You can't do this, he yelled. You can't take what's rightfully ours. Rights? Albert laughed, a bitter laugh. You never had any rights to begin with. Every penny you think you deserve was earned through my work and my trust. You betrayed both. At that moment, Isabella opened a folder of documents on the table and took out the recorder Albert had used. She pressed the play button, and Richard and Agnes's voices filled the room. Richard fell silent, shocked, as the evidence of his greed and disdain for Isabella and Albert echoed. Agnes tried to maintain her composure, but her hands visibly trembled. You recorded us? Richard asked incredulously. You set us up? I had to, Albert replied. You gave me every reason. When the recordings ended, Albert stood up with effort. His voice was lower but laden with authority. This mansion now belongs to the foundation. It will be the main headquarters. You have 1 week to take your things and find another place to live. You will receive only a modest pension, enough to live with dignity. Nothing more. Richard's face turned red with anger. You can't kick us out of here. We're your family. No, Richard, Albert responded, his voice calm but firm. Family is something built on loyalty, respect, and love. Things you never had for me. Agnes, realizing there was no more room for arguments, began to cry, but Albert remained impassive. Isabella, for her part, felt a mix of relief and tension. She knew the confrontation was far from over, but this was a decisive step. As Richard and Agnes left the room, murmuring threats and insults, Isabella looked at Albert. He seemed tired, but also relieved. This is just the beginning, he said with a small smile. But it's an important start. Isabella nodded, feeling that for the first time, something was truly changing. The morning dawned cold, but no colder than the atmosphere inside the mansion. Isabella walked through the hallways, listening in the distance to the muffled murmurs of Richard and Agnes in the office. Since the revelation of the recordings and the transfer of assets, the couple had plunged into frenzy. Incessant phone calls, lawyers hired in a hurry, and heated arguments had become part of the routine in recent days. In the living room, Albert was sitting calmly, observing the documents that confirmed the irreversibility of what had been done. He looked exhausted but determined. Isabella knew that this moment was the culmination of years of manipulation and suffering, and she was ready to face it alongside him. In the office, Richard was standing, talking on the phone with an aggressiveness that Isabella had never witnessed. "You need to reverse this. Don't come to me with legal excuses. Find a loophole, no matter what it takes." He hung up the phone forcefully, looking at Agnes, who was sitting on the sofa with her head in her hands. "This can't stay like this," he said, almost shouting. "That crazy old man can't destroy our lives like this. It's all ours, and we're going to get it back." Agnes looked up at her son, but her expression was different. She no longer carried the same confidence. For the first time, she seemed defeated. "Richard, there's nothing more we can do. Everything is in the Foundation's name. The lawyers confirmed it. It's over." "Over?" Richard stepped forward, his eyes filled with fury. "You want to give up after everything we've done?" In the room, Isabella and Albert heard Richard's heavy footsteps approaching. He entered abruptly, with Agnes right behind him. His face was contorted with anger, but Isabella noticed there was something more: fear. "You destroyed everything," Richard shouted at Albert. "You betrayed us, betrayed your own family." Albert looked at him calmly, something that seemed to provoke Richard's anger even more. "I didn't betray anyone," he replied. "You betrayed me. I just took back what you didn't deserve." Richard laughed, but the sound was bitter, almost uncontrollable. He turned to Isabella, pointing a finger at her as if it were a weapon. It's all your fault. You manipulated him, messed with his head against us. From the beginning, you were never anything but an opportunist." Isabella felt the anger rise but didn't let it show. She stood firm, looking Richard in the eyes. "I wasn't the one who planned to steal a sick father's inheritance," she said, her voice firm and controlled. "I wasn't the one who tried to destroy a life to satisfy my own greed. All I did was defend the only person in this house who truly has integrity." Richard opened his mouth to respond, but Isabella continued, now with more strength. "And you know what else? I'm no longer that woman you belittled for years. I won't accept you accusing me of something only the two of you are guilty of." The room fell silent for a moment, except for the sound of Richard's heavy breathing. He seemed lost, unable to find words to contest Isabella. Agnes beside him was pale, avoiding Albert's gaze. Finally, Albert spoke, his voice cutting through the air like a blade. "You have until the end of the day to leave this house. The mansion now belongs to the Foundation, and you have no more rights over it. Richard, you will receive a pension sufficient to survive, but don't think you're going to live the life of luxury you always wanted. It's time to learn the value of work, something you never knew." Richard took a step forward, but Albert raised his hand, stopping him. "Don't you dare cross that line. I've tolerated too much from both of you. There's nothing more to say or do. This conversation is over." Agnes tried to intervene one last time, with tears in her eyes. "Albert, please, we are your family. This can't end like this. Think about Richard. Think about what he went through. He's your son." Albert stared at her for a long moment, his eyes cold. "Richard was never my son, Agnes, and you know that. But I raised him, loved him, and gave him everything I could, and he chose to betray, just like you." Agnes collapsed onto the sofa, defeated. Richard stood there, fists clenched, but without the courage to face Albert again. With no other option, both left the room in silence, leaving Isabella and Albert alone. When the door closed, Albert let out a long, tired sigh. Isabella sat beside him, touching his hand. "You did what needed to be done," she said sincerely. "I took too long," he replied with a melancholic smile, "but I finally put an end to it." Isabella looked around the room. which no longer seemed like the same place as before. Now that mansion would cease to be a symbol of lies and greed and become something greater, something with purpose. She knew the path would still be long, but she felt ready to face it. The weight of Richard and Agnes's manipulations had finally been lifted. Now, it was time to rebuild. Isabella's first day as president of the Albert Vasconcelos Foundation began with a radiant sun illuminating the transformed mansion. The crystal chandeliers and luxurious furniture now shared space with paintings by local artists and photographs that told stories of transformation, families who received support, young people who achieved education, projects that changed lives. The place no longer exuded ostentation, but purpose. Isabella walked through the hallways with a different posture. There was something new in her gaze, a mix of determination and serenity. She wore an elegant blazer that highlighted her new position. Now, she was no longer the woman subdued by Richard's family. She was someone who controlled her destiny, and the destiny of many who would benefit from the foundation. In the meeting room, a team awaited Isabella. Among them were enthusiastic young people, experienced volunteers, and even Nathan, Albert's trusted lawyer, who now also advised the foundation. Isabella began the meeting confidently. "Starting today, our work will focus on real impact," she said, as she projected the strategic plan on the screen. "Every resource that was once wasted on purposeless luxuries will now have a clear destination: to transform lives." Isabella's words resonated in the room. It was evident that everyone was inspired by her leadership, not just because she had taken on a position of power, but because her personal journey was proof of resilience and transformation. Meanwhile, Albert watched from afar, sitting on a bench in the garden. He had declined the presidency, insisting that Isabella was the right person to lead the new phase. "I've made too many choices in the past," he had told her. "Now, it's your time to decide." As he watched Isabella in action, Albert reflected on his life. Raising Richard had initially been an act of love, but over time he realized how his concessions and secrets had made him vulnerable to manipulation. For years, he had clung to guilt and fear, but now, alongside Isabella, he felt he had finally found redemption. He sighed, thinking about the transformation she had undergone. The woman who once seemed a shadow in that mansion was now an imposing figure, a leader. "She is more than I imagined," he murmured to himself, a sincere smile on his lips. Later, Isabella found Albert in the garden. She sat beside him, and for a few minutes they remained silent, enjoying the gentle breeze and the distant sounds of voices at the foundation. She held his hand with gratitude. "Without you, I would never have found my strength," Isabella said. "And without you, I would never have found peace," Albert replied. "I should have done this a long time ago, but you gave me the courage to act." "It wasn't easy," she said, looking toward the horizon. "But now we have something worthwhile, not just for us, but for so many other people." They stayed there for a while longer as the sun set, symbolizing the end of a turbulent chapter and the beginning of something entirely new. In the months that followed, the foundation grew. Educational projects, health initiatives, and support programs for families began to impact entire communities. The mansion, once a symbol of greed and power, was now a place of hope and transformation. Isabella became a model of leadership. Her story inspired women who also felt trapped in oppressive situations. She showed that it was possible to find strength even in the most difficult circumstances. Albert, for his part, dedicated his days to writing his memoirs. He wanted to leave a record of his mistakes and lessons learned, not as an act of vanity, but as a way to warn and inspire others to follow different paths. One morning, Isabella stopped in front of the old mirror in the main hallway. She looked at her reflection, seeing not just a woman, but a leader. The weight of the past had dissipated, leaving room for something much greater. Albert entered the hallway, interrupting her thoughts. "Ready for another day?" he asked with a smile. "Ready," Isabella replied with conviction. And in that moment, she knew that together they were building something that truly mattered, something that no betrayal or lie could destroy. The past was left behind, buried under the strength of a greater truth, that justice, purpose, and courage would always prevail. I hope you enjoyed today's story. If you did, subscribe to the channel so you don't miss more stories like this. Leave a like and comment below what you thought about the story. See you in the next video.